Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 21st event in the ICSVE series of Zoom panel discussions. We have COVID to thank for this, that we've gone on Zoom and now have these international gatherings, which I quite enjoy. And we, in them, discuss various issues of terrorism and violent extremism. And we had over 130 professionals sign up, and some still signing up at the last minute. I think some are still signing in, we'll see, but there are many conferences on Zoom these days, so I guess we have competition. And we have people, as I said, from all over the world. Harjit from Brazil, George from Brussels, let's see, Ali from Iraq, so many people from all different countries, and we're really glad to see all of you and glad that we have this format that we can discuss from so many different places. And since it's Yom Kippur coming up, I want to wish our Jewish friends, may you be sealed in the book of life, and welcome to you. I'm glad if you could make it. In our last event, we featured Maria Michalowska, Jankolovska, the Executive Secretary of the Interagency Working Group on the Reintegration of FDFs for the government, the Republic of North Macedonia. And she spoke about coordinating her government's multi-agency approach to repatriating Macedonian ISIS fighters and family members from Syria. And we were privileged that we did some training for the social workers and some of the intel and government workers that were going to be receiving and still will be receiving Macedonians from Camp Al Hol and Camp Al Roj to tell them what to expect, what these women and children had undergone, how they usually sound in research interviews, and for the ones that we did interview and that were willing to share their interviews, to actually share their interviews and the background on them, which was very helpful to them. And we were happy to hear from Maria that it looks successful so far. It's really early, but that they've managed to muster a really integrated approach. And you can watch the video of that on our ICSVE events page. And the other 19 previous Zoom events are also there. They're all video recorded. We're recording this one as well. And we always encourage people, go ahead and get on chat. We like it to be lively. A lot of conferences block chat. I don't understand that. I love it. Just go for it and talk as much as you want. It's nice because it's not loud, doesn't distract. And we will harvest questions and ask them of our speaker as we go along. Let's see. If you do go to our website or to our ICSVE YouTube channel, you'll see our 265 short counter-narrative videos featuring mostly ISIS and al-Shabaab insiders denouncing their group and warning people not to join, although we've now added white supremacists and far-right members to it. And in that vein, I can announce that we now have Tian Garrett working with us. He's doing the video editing and helping us with those interviews, doing many, many tasks, and serving as an expert on CVE. We also have some new research fellows, Wilson Warren, Sophia Abinajam, Kate Streiser, and I think I got everybody with that. Oh, Sama Kuba as well. And we're so happy to have all of them. And we're especially proud and happy to have Ambassador Peter Galbraith with us, who's been working on ISIS repatriations and has been working in the area for years and years. I'm going to introduce him in just a minute, but I just have to say a few more things in our introduction. While we welcome everyone to chat, we do have to give a warning, and we learned it the hard way, that please remember that we are in an international gathering of people of different religions, different viewpoints, different political leanings. So please do not insult each other, particularly insulting each other's religion. And if you do, we have learned how to boot you out, and we will. We capture all the chat after the event. We try to answer any questions that we can answer briefly. We don't write long books for people. And then you'll get the chat later along with the link to the video recording. So if you want to pass it to others, or if you'd like to read over the chat, so you don't have to worry about capturing the chat. And then I always like to thank our sponsors, past and present, the US State Department, the European Union, you have a ghost, Peter, UN Women, Facebook, private donors, and the state of Qatar. And I always give a special shout out to the state of Qatar for supporting our Breaking the ISIS Brand counter-narrative project, which has made it possible to have 271 in-depth video interviews of ISIS defectors, returnees, and prisoners, and 16 of al-Shabaab, and also has helped us on a lot of our repatriation work, which I'll touch on in just a second. Let's see. We're also really grateful to have partnered with Facebook, and Molly Ellenberg runs that show. We've done over 150 campaigns around the world, and Molly's very clever on figuring out how to push out the videos to the vulnerable audiences, and also to study how are they responding to it, and even now to send surveys to them to say, you know, what did you think of this video, which is kind of fascinating. And we, as we are able, publish that slowly but surely. So as far as today's presentation, I've been going in and out of Syria, Northeast Syria, working with our friends, the Syrian Democratic Forces and the AINS government, which Ambassador Peter has been a great friend to as well. And these are the people that helped us defeat ISIS. They were on the ground. They had a lot of losses. As a result, we did the air support, technical support, intel support, but they were the ones on the ground fighting, and they were the ones losing their lives and leaving orphan children, as Ambassador Peter pointed out to me just a few minutes ago, that we need to remember that while we're looking at repatriation and children in camps, there's a whole other group of victims as well, and true victims. Let's see, as far as our work going in and out of the camps, immediately I understood that this is a mess, and these kids shouldn't be here. Kids should not be in a prison. The camps are wrongly labeled, they're prisons, and kids are imprisoned. They don't have medicines, they don't have what they need. So one mother told us about her asthmatic child, and that he had turned blue and almost passed out a number of times. I went and bought asthma medicine and brought it right back. We brought balls to the kids. And as we heard stories, we went back to governments with the detainees' permission, of course. And I started asking all the detainees, all the prisoners held by the SDF, and this is with the SDF's permission, of course, can I share your interview with your government's justice ministry in the hopes that you would be repatriated, but probably they will use it to prosecute you. And nearly everyone except from countries like Russia said, please, I would much prefer to be prosecuted at home than to stay here. And I want my children out of here. So we shared information about a woman that we call Salma that was 8 months pregnant, that had had a cesarean section on her first birth. It's not healthy to try to do a vaginal birth after, but that's what she was facing. It's risky. She would be in a high risk group, and she was in the camp. We advocated for Shamima Begum when she had her baby to get the baby at least out of the camp. The baby died. Salma did deliver in the camp, well, in a hospital, but went back to the camp with her infant, and thankfully with a good result. We worked with a lot of Belgian cases, which we took back to the Belgian authorities and said, these are really at-risk families and kids. Can you get them home? Now one of the daughters has been brought home. We've tried to advocate on Huda Mathana's case for her little boy, who, when I interviewed him, had really deep bronchitis. Looked to me like he's one of these kids that could expire because there's a lot of dust, and if you have respiratory problems, and it looked to me, I mean, I'm not a physician, but it looks serious to me. My family doctor always says, after you've had 3 kids, you can call yourself a family doctor as far as diagnosing those kind of things. We've worked with the Germans mainly, sharing cases, 24 cases, but some of them now have been repatriated. We also worked with many other European countries. As I told you, we worked with Macedonia, and now we've been working with Maldives, Trinidad, and I'm going to lose the last one. Oh, and North Macedonia, on getting ready for repatriations, and also looking at how to rehabilitate and and how to prevent more people joining groups like this. And we also shared information with Australia. So we've been active on this, and are pretty outspoken that we don't think kids belong in prisons. So we are so proud to call Ambassador Peter Galbraith, our advisor at ICSVE, and to have any claim to him. And we're proud of his work, past and present. So you may have read in the news that he was instrumental in helping to find a little American girl that was being hidden away by a woman that wasn't her mother, and that she's on her road to coming home now because of Ambassador Galbraith. But I'm going to let him tell those stories. But first, I'll give a short bio for him. Ambassador Peter Galbraith is an author, an academic, multi-talented person, commentator, politician, policy advisor, and former United States diplomat on the level of ambassador, obviously. From 1993 to 98, he served as the first ambassador to Croatia, where he was co-mediator of the 1995 Erdut Agreement that ended the Croatian War of Independence. He was cabinet member in East Timor's first transitional government, successfully negotiating the Timor Sea Treaty. And in 2009, Ambassador Galbraith was an Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations, serving as Deputy Special Representative for Afghanistan. So I think we'll let him tell his repatriation stories first, but we can go to asking him questions about Afghanistan, and he said he'd be very happy to speak about that and has a lot to say. Ambassador Galbraith served 2 terms as a Vermont State Senator from Windham County from 2011 to 2015, and was a candidate for Governor of Vermont in 2016. I hope you try again. He is the author of 2 critically acclaimed books on the Iraq War, including the best-selling End of Iraq, How American Incompetence Created a War Without End. Oh, isn't that so true? And Ambassador Galbraith argues that Iraq has broken up into 3 parts, allowing for Kurdistan's independence. And he's been a great friend to the Kurds. In the 1980s, Galbraith uncovered the beginnings of the Anfal campaign against the Iraqi Kurds. And in 1988, he documented the use of chemical weapons, leading the US Senate to pass comprehensive sanctions legislation authored by Ambassador Galbraith. I'm running out of steam. He was in Kurdistan during the 1991 uprising, and his reports, including video footage of the uprising's collapse, contributed to the US decision to create a safe area. Beginning in 2003, Ambassador Galbraith was an informal advisor to the Kurdistan Regional Government in northern Iraq, supporting the Kurdistan delegation in the drafting process of the 2005 Iraqi constitution. He is on the board of directors of the Center for Arms Control and Nonproliferation. He's the research arm of the Council for a Livable World, and he's an advisor to ICSVE. Oh, losing my voice. And even during COVID, Ambassador Galbraith has been willing to risk his own life to go in and out of Syria to try to help with some of these really difficult cases. So the floor is yours. And I wonder if you would tell us maybe first a little bit about this case with Amina, the little girl that we did manage to get an interview of, but we're not going to show it because she's just a child.
Sure. And thank you, Anne, for inviting me to participate and for that extremely generous introduction. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. So the story of Amina Bradley. This goes back to sort of the beginnings of my connections in the camps, and I'll since we have a bit of time, I'll sort of explain the origins of this. I suppose Bernard Kouchner, who was the founder of Doctors Without Borders and later Foreign Minister of France, and I are the 2 Westerners, at least the 2 people who have served in government with the longest association with the Kurds, going back to the 70s and mine to the 1980s. And we were together involved in various efforts to mediate among different groups and within the broader Kurdish community. And toward the end of 2018, we were asked for our advice by the SDF and the Autonomous Administration, what to do about the growing number of fighters, women and children, particularly foreign, that is to say, not Iraqi, not Syrian. I don't think we never quite, well, we didn't actually reach an agreement because Bernard and I had very different views about whether you remove the children from the camps. And my view is that it's a human rights most serious human rights violation is to keep children in prison. And his is that it's a more serious violation to take a children away from its mother. And that's a debatable point. But in the course of this, I encountered a German woman in Al Hol who said that she wanted to send her children back to Germany, and her mother and father, the children's grandparents, were prepared to receive them. I met her in September, and she had a phone, so I was able to communicate. She provided a lot of information that not only showed that she no longer had any connection to the Islamic State, but was very willing to cooperate with law enforcement in terms of identifying people who had committed crimes and who were still dangerous. And I contacted the Germans. I said to the Germans, German government, that, you've taken out orphans. Why couldn't you just treat these children as if they were orphans? And they agreed. And so finally I went back in November in between the two events, there'd been the Turkish invasion. We were able to bring out the children, and at the last minute, the Germans said, well, we won't object if you bring the mother. And so the mother came, and I have to say, she's back in Germany, she's in university, she's gotten her own apartment, and she sends pictures of the kids at the Christmas market and Easter egg and hunts and, doing things that normal German kids do. And I think it is they're individual histories. And so it's important not to think of the group as a whole. But as a consequence of that, other women in the camps got my WhatsApp number and got in touch. And one of them was a Canadian woman who described an American woman from Tennessee who had been who was a convert to Islam and who had been killed along with her husband, who turned out her second husband, who was an Australian Lebanese pediatrician who had also been killed, and her son had been killed, but her daughter who had been lightly wounded and survived. And I consulted with the FBI and determined that this woman was Ariel Bradley, and that the child was Amina. The problem was that Amina was in Al Hol camp, which, as you know, and I think probably most people on this call knows, is a sprawling place with something like 70,000 people, and basically is run by the extremists. It's a prison, but the prisoners run the prison. And efforts to recover children have been mostly unsuccessful. And in fact, the danger was that when you went to look for the child, the children would be hidden away and then smuggled out. And this happened to a couple of other American children. So it really wasn't feasible to launch a search for Amina there. But the Canadian woman, who is of Somali origin, and explained that that it was a group of radical Somali women who were hiding the child. The child didn't look anything like a Somali person, And eventually, the Somali women, along with Amina, were transferred to Roj camp, but to the part of Roj camp that is for the new arrivals and the more extreme people. And there, the security was much better. And once that took place, I was able to talk to to General Mazloum about the possibility of a rescue operation. And of course, he readily agreed. And this summer, they launched a rescue based on the information provided by the Canadian woman. And so Amina was rescued, put in with a custody of some very kind Kurdish women who took care of her for a while, DNA testing, establishing her identity, although there really wasn't any doubt. I then notified the FBI and the State Department that she'd been rescued. Once the DNA tests came back, they flew her and also her brother. There were three boys, and this was a source of some confusion. One child was killed in the airstrike, but the full biological brother had also survived, and he was in the orphanage in Al Hol. And so the children went from Hasaka to Baghdad and are now back in the United States. There's another part of this story, which is that the Canadian woman who was known in the camp for having cooperated with the camp authorities, believed correctly to be cooperating with the FBI, US law enforcement through me, was clearly going to be at risk when this operation took place. So again, with thanks to the very understandable humanitarian decisions of the SDF and of course the cooperation of the KRG, I was able to bring her out because she would have been at great risk. I'd already brought her daughter out in March because she too wanted to send her daughter out rather than have her daughter grow up in the miserable conditions in these camps. They are prisons, and I think it's very important. We use the word camp, but that connotes something like a refugee camp. No, they're prison camps. They're guarded. That people cannot go in and out, and they're basically under indefinite detention. So you have to ask: is this a place where a child should grow up? Without schooling, with minimal health care, in an environment run by radical women. And of course, while some of the non-radical women, the women who've rejected the Islamic State, obviously are not, like Hoda Mutana, are not passing their values on to their children, many of the radical women are. So in some sense, you're also, it's a breeding ground for the next generation of jihadis, murderers, rapists, kidnappers. If you apply the standard of what's in the best interest of the child, I would say that's not in the best interest of any child. In that case, it's not in the best interest of anybody else either. So I do think we focus on repatriation, but we have to recognize that most of the people in these camps are not going to be repatriated. There is some progress. Here we're talking about the foreigners, and I would say there are about 10,000 foreigners, about 2,000 fighters, 3,000, 4,000 women, 6,000, 7,000 children. Most of them are not going to be repatriated. And so then the question is, do you leave the children in the camps, or do you take them out of the camps in some other environment, obviously away from their mothers, where there'll be a greater chance of repatriation, because almost every country that refuses to repatriate its adults is willing to repatriate its children, but also where they could grow up in a different kind of environment where they could get an education and not be radicalized. I just want to say a couple of words. First, it's very important to understand that the SDF and the Autonomous Administration in Northeast Syria is doing a huge amount for these people. I mean, these are the family members of the people who were attacking them, killing them. And in the case of the women, many of them were participants in these crimes. And they themselves suffered 10,000 dead, which means there are tens of thousands of children who've lost at least one family. Parts of the Islamic State attacked and destroyed, drove people away from their homes, destroyed their homes. So there are people whose economic conditions and living standards have plunged. And as we focus, I think perfectly correctly, on the humanitarian plight of the women and children, it's also very important to remember the victims of the Kurds and also the Yazidis, not with, of course, the people who were murdered, the people who are still missing, and the young women who were kidnapped, and then once they were liberated, had their children taken away from them. So, there's so many wrongs that have happened, and I think we just need to keep all of them in our minds.
Thank you, Peter. There's two really controversial things that one of them that you and I are in strong agreement on, and you saw I kind of got kicked out of Repatriate the Children. It's nonprofit because of my stance on this, but we're in agreement with you that if kids are held in a prisoner of war camp and it's actively getting missiled and they're in danger of death, that it is in the best interest of the child to be rescued, even if you cannot rescue the mother. My view on that is it's like you're on the Titanic and you have so many lifeboats. If you can put the kids in the lifeboats and the mothers have to stay on the boat and the mother is handing you her child willingly, probably you should take the child. But that is extremely controversial, and it is a matter of policy. And big organizations that work for the rights of children bring up legislation that does not allow for that, and maybe rightly so. But we also have to be realistic. And the other thing is, and I wonder what kind of hate mail I'm going to get for that. But I'm not saying that I don't believe the women should come home. I do believe they should come home. I believe everyone should be brought home and repatriated and face prosecution. And one of the reasons for that is some of these people have been held for quite a long time, and the women usually get short sentences in Europe. So how are we going to handle this thorny issue of time served already? Or we have a case in the UK where someone was going to be sent home from Turkey and he'd been successfully prosecuted in Turkey, but the UK laws did not allow him to be prosecuted again for the same crime, even though he was being released from Turkey. So these are really thorny issues. And one of the things that I'm trying to start at our center, so anybody can send me cases if you'd like to, and Ambassador Galbraith has a few, we have a few, of people that have come home and are successfully reintegrated. There's Laura Pisoni in Belgium. She goes around, she took one of her children into ISIS. As far as everyone knows, she was never a fighter or a supporter of fighters. She tried to escape twice, the second time successfully. Her husband was locked up. She got a stay of sentence. She goes around to high schools and lectures and tells kids, don't be fooled. That's a success story. Matthew al-Hassani, a lot of people were worried about him because he had been forced to make, this is an American boy, Samantha al-Hassani's son. At 10 years old, he was forced to make a video threatening the US. He's just appeared in a documentary movie and seems to be doing all right. And, kids are really malleable. And when they get home to love, consistency, predictable circumstances, support, they probably do need therapy, but they're just as likely as your other average teenager to be a danger to you or I. And We need to get the kids out of there one way or another. And we also need to lift the burden off the soldiers of the SDF. And that's one of the things that I've been asked, especially by Turks. How can you be such a fan of the SDF? Don't you know they're all terrorists? And my answer always is, seems to me they defeated ISIS. Those are the terrorists. And our military tells me that SDF has not launched attacks other than when they're fighting back, but not terrorist attacks into Turkey. And I don't have access to the actual intel. But the thing that has impressed me over and over again, just as Ambassador Galbraith just said, is that these are people that killed their family members that they had to fight. And you see them treating their prisoners pretty well. And it's such a stark difference from other countries where I've been in the prisons and I see marks of torture. They come in and they start screaming, "You're an American, please save me, I'm being tortured." And they show me, the marks on their arms and legs. Doesn't happen with the SDF. I'm not saying that people aren't occasionally mistreated. Of course, that happens everywhere in every prison. But to see the humanity and the idea of we have to forgive, we have to house these people as best we can. We have to offer them education if we can. And please, to the other countries, take them home. So those are all points that I would raise. But I also want to pivot just a little bit, unless you want to jump in on that, Peter. But now we're seeing a lot of people have gone to Afghanistan, and we're going to continue to see them going to Afghanistan. Would you like to make some remarks on that as well? But go ahead and say whatever you would like.
I think I want to stay on this topic for just a little bit longer. First, I think one has to draw the distinction between mothers who are willing to send their children out.
And there are many.
Those that who want to put them on the lifeboat, if you will, of the Titanic, and those who don't want to send their children out, those who are on the Titanic, who decide that they would just as soon have their children drowned with them. And my view is, if you can only rescue so many people, and it's not possible to rescue the mothers, and I think we have to be realistic here, most countries are not going to take back their adults. Then what do you do with the children? Do you let them drown with their mothers? Do you let them stay in these prisons? Or do you do what you would do in the West, which is not incarcerate a child with its mother, but remove the child from prison and put the child into some kind of foster care or with relatives? And that's especially true since the prospects for repatriation are much greater if countries can just take back their children. And I think we need to look at this list because it's very country specific. Now, I will say that there are some European countries that have moved from a position of no repatriation to repatriation. I recounted the story of Germany in 2019, which was basically said only orphans, but then expanded it to, where this woman wanted to send her children out. And at the last minute, basically was persuaded that the woman was a good person and that, which she is, and that her children, that she should come with her children. I have to say, I think the Germans, the German government's a very humanitarian approach. I'm very admiring, but I think that they were also impressed, that the mother was willing to sacrifice herself for her children. And like the judgment of Solomon, that showed who the good person was. But now they've moved to a broader repatriation. Sweden is doing more, Finland, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium. But there are countries that are not. France has been very clear. It will take back its children up to a certain age, maybe 9, but it will not take back the adults. I see no prospect that is going to change. And among the Europeans, the French have the largest number of people there. And incidentally, one can even understand the thinking of the French here. There were people who had been in Syria, who were involved in the attack on the Bataclan theater, and also I think on one of the Brussels attacks, the subway attack, as well as I think a beheading. So if you're the president of France, and never mind that you're thinking about re-election against Marine Le Pen, somebody on the far right, but let's assume you're not going to run for re-election. Your sole motivation is the well-being of France. How do you balance the lives of 250 innocent people who are attending a concert in a theater in Paris against hundreds of people who voluntarily chose to go to Syria to join a terrorist organization? I mean, we can debate as to whether the adults should come back, but I think it's important to understand there's a plausible argument behind what the French are doing. But we don't need to debate that, because this is just the reality. France, Britain, Canada, Bangladesh, some of the North African countries are not going to take their people back. And there are a whole group of them. In fact, I would think most of these women are not going to be repatriated. And therefore, the question is, do you just leave the children in the camps, or do you take them out and form something like what happened after the Second World War with the SOS children's villages, where they will have care and education, and the possibility then of either integrating into the local society or going back to their home countries. Once they grow up in the camps, they are never going to be able to leave either. It is going to be a life sentence for the children. And so, to some degree, some of the organizations that simply take the view that every country should take back their people and keep insisting on that, it's a lovely point in principle, but it is in effect going to consign a significant number of children to a potential lifetime in prison.
That's a really good point. And I want to bring one other case to mind, but I know you still have more to say, but it just, somebody else said, you mentioned earlier that when they tried to do a rescue of American kids that were known to be in Al Hol, they suddenly disappeared, which isn't surprising because Al Hol is, I would say it's run by the SDF, but it's definitely badly run because they don't have the resources to do what they need to do, and they don't have the man-woman power. And when I talked to the guards there, they showed me scratch marks and beatings and things that had happened to them from these ISIS enforcers. And there was just a murder last week. But we have this horrible story where an Albanian, the CVE coordinator, came up to me with his phone and said, "Anne, this is the little girl that was taken to ISIS. She was like 10 or 11 years old. Her name was Eva. And Eva was taken by her father. The mother was left back in Albania, didn't know that her kids were going. So the sister and brother were taken. Father was killed. And the grandmother got so crazy. And I really love this grandmother. The CVE coordinator said we have no evidence that she was an ISIS supporter, but she went to Raqqa to live with those kids. So she, must have, made herself look presentable to ISIS or willing to live under ISIS. She ended up in Al Hol. And we tracked Eva when we went back in to help the Albanians get her back. And some of what you were doing of, introducing the CVE coordinator to the SDF and the AINS government and trying to work it out between the two of them, that they'd like to bring Eva back. But I heard something so chilling about a month or two ago when we were working with the Macedonians that were about to come back. And that was that when her government finally worked it out to come and get her and her brother was somewhere else, that the ISIS enforcers knew about it and came to her and threatened her. So she just disappeared. And I don't know where she is. I don't know if she's gotten home, but we talked to her on the phone and said, we're coming to Al Hol because we wanted to start helping the process. And when we came to Al Hol, nobody could find her. Later, she was threatened by these ISIS enforcers and disappeared. So one of the people is asking, what happened to these American kids that were spirited out? And that goes to your question of, we're giving these kids a life sentence and we don't know, are they going to end up in Idlib? Are they going to get sold out of the camp as ISIS brides or ISIS fighters as youth? Because it's not that hard to get them out of Al-Hol illegitimately.
Right. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about the case of the two American children, but they were spirited out of Al-Hol, and so they're in another location in the custody of extremists.
So horrible.
Yeah, it's horrible. There are not many. I know of a few more Americans who are there, and I'll leave it at that. But it's not a. I'm talking about children. It's not a large number of children, of American children, because the U.S. has been repatriating, and the U.S. government is seized with this issue, is working on it. I think it's doing the best job that you could expect in very difficult circumstances. I do think it's important again to underscore all that the SDF is doing, given how the very limited resources, and the truth is that countries have not stepped up to either provide. What needs to be provided is substantially expanded jail space for men, because you can see, I visited some of these jails, there are 30 men to a cell. It isn't out of any inhumanity, it's simply that the space isn't there, so that this needs to be expanded. There needs to be training for the guards. Frankly, some of the women should not be in the open prison, if you want to call them Mirage and Al-Hol. They should be also in prisons.
With cooking knives available to them.
Oh yeah, there are cooking knives, heating, kerosene. People get burned to death. Tents get burned down. That's burning down tents is one of the common ways of enforcing discipline and punishing people. In most extreme cases, making sure that nobody can get out. So they're clearly when I say it's true, the SDF runs the perimeter of the prison and they have offices there. But when I've been in Al-Hol, they've been reluctant even to let me go into the camp in an armored vehicle. And so, that's a suggestion that it's not, they don't consider it very, very safe. And that's different. You can go around in Raj. In the early part, I did go around a bit in Al-Hol, but now it's, more or less going to the camp office. In terms of justice, this is also a complicated issue, because correctly speaking, trials should take place in the country where the crime was committed. If a British subject commits a crime in the United States, we don't send them back to Britain to be prosecuted. We prosecute them here. The whole argument about repatriate them, it makes it more complicated to actually prosecute people, because the evidence isn't there. The place where the crime was committed isn't the country to which they're returning, and there isn't some automatic human right to be returned to your own country after you've committed a crime in another country. What there is, of course, a right to of a speedy trial. And again, the SDF have a couple of problems. Again, such a huge number of cases. The fact that they're an unrecognized entity, and therefore, what is the validity of their courts? They aren't really Syrian courts. And maybe they don't have the full expertise to I'm putting this diplomatically, to conduct trials by the same standards that you might expect in Western Europe. But this is an additional complicating factor. Let me stop there and take your next question.
How would you, you're a lawyer, so how would you deal with the question of they entered the country illegally? So Syria never let them in, most of them. And you are dealing with an unrecognized entity. And are they prisoners of war? Because at some point when a war ends, you do have a duty to process your prisoners. And who should be processing them? I mean, we were fighting a war there as well. I mean, these can be seen as our prisoners as much as the, or the coalition's prisoners, as much as the SDF. I mean, we've kind of dumped this on the Kurds, and they are an unrecognized entity. So how does that get dealt with? I know I talked to Ambassador Rapp a little bit about this, and he said we're starting to see precedents for if a non-state actor controls a whole territory, that it's starting to be recognized as they are the law of the land in that area. I don't know.
Certainly, as you suggest, it is a complicated question, but I think we need to be clear. These people did not surrender to the United States, and they did not surrender to the coalition. They surrendered to the SDF. I don't know. I've interviewed a lot of them. I don't know anybody who's in an SDF prison who actually surrendered to an American soldier or to a coalition soldier. So they are, correctly speaking, the prisoners of the SDF. And clearly, if you're a partner with a combatant, you don't assume all the responsibilities that the combatant, especially in this circumstances where the U.S. was providing air support and a very small number of special forces and financing. I don't think it's a very strong case to say that terrorist organizations have the same rights under the Geneva Convention as would soldiers of a state. And also, most of our focus here has been on people who were not combatants, namely women and children. And clearly, the children are not. They're not prisoners of war. They're not criminals, and they shouldn't be in prison.
Can you answer this question? What different policy decisions have the current U.S. administration made compared to the previous administration regarding SDF camps? This is from Thomas. I don't see your last name, Thomas.
Well, there's a totally different relationship between the Biden administration and the SDF and the Trump administration and the SDF. As you will recall, the Trump administration, but Donald Trump in October of 2019, basically he told Erdogan he had a green light to attack the Syrian Kurds, which Erdogan did. And this was just weeks after the SDF had finished a campaign in partnership with the United States to defeat the Islamic objective. Obviously, their objective, but ours as well. So it was a big screw you to an ally that had borne the burden of the fight. Then Trump was persuaded not about any of the people who had been our allies or who suffered so much, but he was sold on the idea that there were oil fields there that possibly the U.S. could hold on or at least deny to the Islamic State, although in fact these oil fields were not going to go under the control of the Islamic State, and even if they did, you have to be able to transport oil. But it was a phony reason, but he swallowed that hook, line, and sinker, and so a much reduced force remained. Biden, who has had an association with the Kurds that goes back to August of 1990, and I know this because I was working for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and the Kurdish leaders came to Washington just after the invasion of Kuwait, and I introduced them. These were Iraqi Kurds to Senator Biden and the other senators on the committee. He actually visited Iraqi Kurdistan prior to the U.S. invasion. He was there in 2002, spoke to the Kurdistan parliament. So this is a man who knows the issue very well, knows the people, and is very supportive. He was highly critical of what Donald Trump had done. The administration has gone out. It's made it very clear that the U.S. is not interested in the oil. And in fact, they have canceled a license that an American company had to work to market Syrian Kurdish oil, and have instead said our reason to be here is to be here to protect for the people and to continue the defense against the Islamic State. So one of the things that the Kurds now know is they've got America's got their back at least for 4 years. Whereas, Donald Trump was somebody whose word they couldn't possibly rely on because it, could change with the next tweet. But Joe Biden is obviously a very, very solid person, and it's a solid administration. So that changes the dynamic. And it does mean, that more resources could be devoted to, improving prison conditions, improving prison security, improving conditions within the prison camps. And some of that's already taking place. There is some schooling going on, at least a few days a week. In some of these camps, the kids actually leave the camp and go to a nearby school. And, it would be great if more of that took place. But I think what there really means is that there's time to take this next step, take the children out of the camps, build these SOS villages, have the process of educating, taking care of the children in a non-radical environment, and facilitating repatriation.
Thank you for that. That is a question that I've been asked a number of times from very anxious Kurds in the Syrian territory, asking, now that Biden has taken the troops out of Afghanistan, will they do the same to us, and will we be abandoned? And that is a big issue. And it also relates to, are we leaving all these prisoners, some who are highly radicalized, in an area where they could be freed by groups like ISIS or other groups? And so it's good to hear that you think Biden has their back for the next 4 years. I'd like you to say a bit more about that. And then after that, we have a question from Faria. Faria would like to ask a question, but if you don't mind answering that question first, since it goes with what you just said. How do you see the Biden administration? Are they going to stay in as far as supporting Northeast Syria and the Ains government, the SDF? And what is the safety issue as far as continuing to house the ISIS prisoners there?
Well, first, in terms of I think it's very important that everybody, including, I know there's some Syrian Kurdish friends on this Zoom, to understand the difference between Afghanistan and Rojava. In Afghanistan, the United States spent $2 trillion, deployed well over 100,000 troops, spent hundreds of billions trying to build up an Afghan government, nation building, and not in what Afghans might have wanted, but what we thought they should have, build up a military force. And after all that expenditure, it didn't even last until the end of the American withdrawal period. The last 2 weeks of the American withdrawal, up to the August 31st deadline, took place with the Taliban in charge. I contrast that. My first trip to Afghanistan was February 14th, 1989. Now that happened to be I went with the Mujahideen. It happened to be the day that the Soviets finished their withdrawal. The Soviet puppet regime of Najibullah, that's what we called it, the puppet regime, that puppet lasted a full 3 years after the Soviet withdrawal. It actually lasted longer than the Soviet Union. So, the scale of the failure of the United States in Afghanistan is epic. And the reason is, we engaged in nation building. We decided to do this all ourselves. We didn't have a partner. And for these kinds of campaigns to work, you need to have a partner. It is the exact opposite in Rojava. First, we aren't trying to remake Rojava into some kind of American vision of what Rojava should be. We are simply supporting the SDF and the AANES in their activities to accomplish their objective. It was that they were the ones who were fighting the Islamic State, and we came to help them. And our footprint is very small. We were not carrying the burden of the fight. They were. We didn't send it. We sent in hundreds of troops, not hundreds of 100,000 plus. And and our expenditures have been, a tiny fraction of what they were in Afghanistan. I suppose not even 1%. So it's really an entirely different situation.
No, that's a good answer. Okay, Faria, do you want to unmute and ask your question? You had your hand up.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be in this forum, Ambassador Galbraith and yourself. I was looking forward to it. First statement that I would like to make is, I worked with over 500 militants and 242 in Sawat, then in Quetta, then in Bara. And I have gone into detail with their family history and analyzing them. It has been a painful process to try and understand exactly what the push and pull factors were. But one thing stands out. These children whose mothers you leave behind, they will be adversaries tomorrow. Somehow or the other, they will get in touch with their parents, and they may become adversaries, especially if their life goals, their trajectories. The two things that I find have worked for us, why we have recidivism of 2 now, but until very recently we had 0. They were all very well employed, was because we supported them after we reintegrated them.
Can you talk
they went to college.
Can you talk about where you did this? Because we don't have any context of where you.
Pakistan.
Okay.
Sawat. Sawat. Yes, in the valley of Sawat after the counterinsurgency. And there were young boys, I'll just go back a little bit and tell you, there were many young boys who were apprehended. And this general that I knew from the relief work that I used to do asked me to just profile them. I'm a clinical and neuropsychologist. And believe me, I was very scared when I was driving up. There was a lot of security. But meeting them, I realized they were more scared of me than I was of them. And the one thing that stood out is they lack critical thinking skills. And they very easily congealed a lot of negative emotions into a huge, aggressive instrument to hit out at everybody else because they were feeling those negative emotions. Bara was different because it was one community, the Fridis. Quetta was entirely different because these boys were not trained to be militants, but they were just given $20 or $30 to go place a hand grenade. And they did it and off they went. So first of all, I think leaving Al-Hol really, really concerns me. I wish I could go there because I think that whole population of 66,000 or whatever is in danger of becoming adversaries. One needs to belong, unless there are social workers there already, unless there are people engaging them in sports or in some activities. If there's no bonding with any authority figure there in around that camp, what are they going to hang on to? Nothing. They have nothing there. And there are so many miscreants who would like to use them for themselves. I do believe, as Zimbardo says quite rightly, that no one is born a militant or a hero. It's the moment. It's that moment when you realize that you have to do something and you do it.
Thank you.
So,
Can I ask you,
Yeah, I
yes,
think,
Laura, if I may,
please.
so you say that if they're removed from the camps, from their mothers,
Yes.
then they're sort of guaranteed to grow up to be radicals.
No, they're not. They're not guaranteed, but they're vulnerable to be adversaries. And
Okay.
that moment, as Zimbardo says, could be anything. Could be him missing his mother, meeting a woman who looks like his mother. There was one boy I had whose father was killed by the army during the.
I'm sorry. Let me get back to the choice, because the choice is not between repatriating the mothers and the children, because most countries, most of these people will not be repatriated, no matter how much we say they should be.
Okay.
The choice is between leaving the children in these prison camps with all the adverse conditions there, and in a situation where when they grow up, they will still be in the prison camps, because there's no exit from the prison camps. They're not Syrian nationals. They're not part of the SDF. They can hardly go into as adults into the local society where they were involved in killing people. So they're stuck in the prisons and they grow up there. Or having them removed from the prisons, the children go to some kind of SOS village. But are you arguing that it would be better to keep them in prison because it's too risky to take them out?
I'm not. The school that I ran, Sabaun, was completely free. I pleaded with the army to let them move around, to do what they wanted to do. And these children gained multiple identities, not just I'm a Pashtun, but I'm a Pashtun, I'm a student, I'm a Pakistani, and I'm a Muslim. When you have multiple identities, you can cope with. No, I don't think, but let's say you mentioned SOS. Why not recruit the mothers of those children as the mothers at SOS? Train them to be those mothers.
Well, this would be for the and it may be that could be done in some cases where the SDF are sure that the mothers are not radical. Obviously, you wouldn't want the ISIS radicals to be there.
Yeah.
But sure, there are some that I think that's actually a good idea. But the point is that unlike the situation you're describing Pakistanis in the SWAT who would remain Pakistani citizens. These are foreigners we're talking about who cannot just live freely in Kamishli or Derek or any of these cities, because that's not an acceptable outcome. And countries like Bangladesh won't take them back.
I think for we have to move on. We have to move on, but I would love to have you come and speak with us for a whole hour.
One last statement.
Yes. Okay.
Most of these children left their villages to go and live somewhere else in Afghanistan or on the border or some other valley. So they did leave their homes. And we had a difficult time to reintegrate them back into their villages. For at least 6 months, the social worker would be there trying to help them to just be proactive in the village, cleaning it or teaching other children so that the elders of the village saw them as an asset rather than somebody whom they could look down upon. Anyway, okay, fine. I could go on and on, but
no, I'm sure you could.
The point remains that Pakistan was willing to take them back. And that is, if France is not willing to take them back, and it will never be willing. That's the kind of distinction.
But Germany would.
I'm going to move on, but I would love to have you come speak for us one day about your experiences. And so please send me your email and your WhatsApp. And there's other people asking you to give it as well. And so you're going to be inundated. But I'm afraid I don't want to just go off on only one question or only one set of questions. Jorge Bento Silva, who is at the EU, asks to Ambassador Galbraith, maybe you want to voice your own question. Would you like to ask it yourself, or should I read it out? Okay, no answer, so I'm going to read it out. What would, in your view, be the most effective avenue for change? Forcing the issue through the court system to establish jurisprudence on the best interest of the child, to leading media campaigns with names and faces of the kids to move public opinion. We've actually been thinking about doing this in Iraq and in Trinidad because we have a video of the kids. Mobilize leaders of opinion, including religious leaders, to engage pressure on parliaments and governments, or 4, a combination of the above. And if you'd like to see that, that's in chat if reading it was too complicated.
Well, the answer is all of the above.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's important to recognize that even when you do all of the above, you are not going to get to 100%. I mean, let's take the case of Denmark, where there's been a public campaign on behalf of the Danish children. The Danish government is a humanitarian government and has responded and is taking back its citizens. But a fair number of the people who left Denmark to go there actually never had Danish citizenship. They were permanent residents. And so they've lost that permanent residence. They can't go back. Therefore, their children were never Danish citizens. Or in a couple of cases, the children are Danish citizens, but the parents aren't. And so, it's unreasonable to expect countries to take, even if they're very humanitarian, to take back people who are not their citizens. Even some part of the Danish contingent, if you will, is going to be stuck there. I mean, basically forever. There's nobody to take them back. We have the case of Shamima, which you've talked about. Britain is not going to take her back. It stripped her of her citizenship. It's gone to the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom. They've ruled against her. The position is that she's a Bangladesh citizen. Well, in order to be a Bangladesh citizen, she would have had to apply for her citizenship before she was 21. She didn't do that. So she's not actually a Bangladesh citizen either. And furthermore,
she's said to be eligible because of her father's.
No, but only
passport,
if
but Bangladesh refuses. They say absolutely not. We will not give her a passport.
Well, and even if she had been eligible, once she passed age 21, she was no longer eligible. But more importantly, the foreign minister said, and if she came back, we'd hang her.
Oh.
So yeah. So that is not going to be a big incentive. So what do you do in a case like that, or Hoda Mutana, who in an absolutely correct decision, the courts have ruled that she wasn't an American citizen. This goes to the very important principle of diplomatic immunity, which you and I both know is important to the conduct, but it's had a very sad result in this case. But so that's the effort cannot, to come back to the question, cannot just be confined to urging countries to repatriate. There has to be a second track which deals with the people who are not going to be repatriated. And it's now been 2 years. Do we get to that second track in 3, 4, 5 years if we don't start it now? And we really are consigning a generation of children to a very bad outcome.
I would add to that point that a lot of the Balkans that we were working with and making a survey in the camps of, we asked them what they saw as their needs when they came home so that we could correctly advise, particularly the North Macedonian government, on how to be prepared with their social workers. And then we also told what we knew from our 271 interviews, because we ask a lot about trauma history and their experiences in ISIS and how their kids are doing. But we also asked about education, and they told us that our kids are being educated at a low level, as you pointed out, because there's not resources for it, but they're not being educated in their own language. So the older the kids are, they may be speaking to their mother in their native tongue, but every kid that's exposed to bilingual will usually stop speaking to their parents unless their parents are just adamant about it. If everyone else is speaking a different language, they just come home and speak Arabic to mom. And if she knows it, she answers, right? Or, you just get in problems. But anyway, these kids are illiterate. So they may not even be able to speak their language. Most can, but they're illiterate because they're not learning to read and write, and the parents aren't being provided with books and so on. I mean, at a bare minimum, that's something to give the mothers books in their own language to be able to read with their kids, so that when and if they come home, they're not illiterate. But I have another question for you here from, let's see, I think, again, from Thomas. Asking.
And before we go to that, I want to address one question in the chat, which is from Emmanuel Didier, who writes about, he has quite a few points, but the one that I seize on about trying to get a Yazidi woman out of Al Hol, but although she is treated there as a slave, she wants to stay with her child because ISIS women told her she could leave, but she would have to leave her child behind. To be clear, she could leave the camp with her child. The ISIS women have no control over that. Mm-hmm. The problem is that once she comes out, what happened in the past, in 2019, was that the Yazidi house, the Yazidi volunteer establishment that was going into the camps, trying to find and rescue Yazidi women, then forced these women to give up their children. And the women went back to Sinjar and the children to an orphanage in northeast Syria. And that is why so many of the Yazidi women refused to identify themselves as Yazidi, because they knew they would lose their children. And there's a documentary out of it, which really it tells only, it's called Sabaya. It's gotten a very good reviews from very credulous reviewers who don't understand the situation, because it shows the Yazidi house going in and finding these women. And in one scene, they go in and the women are all in their niqabs and they're lifting up the veils to look at the faces to find the Yazidi woman. Well, if the Yazidi woman had wanted to be found, she could have said, "Oh, it's me. I want to get out." But she didn't want to be found because she didn't want to lose her children. However, in this year, I was able to reunite. Now it's 16 mothers and 24 children after 2 years. And so this woman now should know that, and this was very much with the cooperation of the KRG and the SDF. It was a very difficult decision for both sides because, the Yazidi community is politically powerful and it was victims. They want to respect the rights of the community, but both sides understood that the rights of these mothers overrode the rights of the community. And so if this mother, and I would say this to Emmanuel, if this mother wants to leave Al Hol, she can do so with her child. She should just go to the camp office, identify herself. They'll take her out immediately with her child, and her child will not be taken away from her. This is the new situation, and she will be repatriated to Iraq. If she can't go back to her community, then she will have the opportunity for third country resettlement. So please be in touch with this woman. If you have a way, tell her that she for sure can leave with her child. They will not take her child away, and she can be, if she gets back to Iraq, we will make sure that she's able to go for third country resettlement if she chooses not to go back to her community, because the community has made threats against these women. In fact, and there've been death threats and all sorts of things. So, but there is a way out for her. So.
Bravo, Peter. That's so good to hear. And because we've heard too from people working with the Yazidis that did get home, that there's cases where they were separated from their children in order to go back to their home communities. So we do need third country. Oh my God, I have someone knocking at my door. I'll let someone else speak. There was another question for you about, is there more Turkish attacks in Rojava, and what does the prospective situation look like for Turkish's continued activity targeting Kurdish territory and the Kurds to maintain their own security as well as the security of the camps? I'm going to open the door.
I'm just going to take 1 minute to recommend this book. Please read it.
Okay.
It just came out, Homeland Security by Carla Power. She's wonderful. Please do read it.
Thank you. Let me address the question of Turkey's role. There's sporadic fighting between Turkish proxies, if you will, mercenaries that been hired from among the Syrians who went to Turkey, and the SDF. And most of the human rights violations that have taken place in northeast Syria have not been by the Turkish army per se, but by these mercenaries who were sponsored by Turkey. And some of the human rights violations have been very horrific. However, since Joe Biden became president, Turkey has a role. Turkey's been much quieter in northeast Syria because they know that Joe Biden will not support, will not tolerate the behavior that Donald Trump tolerated or encouraged.
We have another question for you that is from Victoria Gorovich. She says, if the adults will never be repatriated, what do their home countries think will happen to them? I mean, I guess you have to imagine this. If France, for example, unequivocally will not return their citizens, what does France think will happen to them? And I guess I would add to that, because this has been discussed when we've attempted to write papers on repatriation, not being lawyers, I'm a psychologist. If they did ever get a tribunal or a hybrid court in Rojava, most women get short sentences. What happens after they serve their sentence? Or if their time, some of these women have been in the camps longer than 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. What happens when sentence is served? Are they released into Rojava? Do they finally get sent home to France? I mean, what happens?
Well, precisely. So to answer the question, from the point of view of some governments, this is a perfect solution. These dangerous people, as they see it, and some of them are indeed dangerous, are being held in prison by the Syrian Kurds. Obviously, to hold a prisoner for a year in a Syrian Kurdish prison is a tiny fraction of the cost of holding a prisoner in a French prison or a Norwegian prison or a US prison. I think the cost per year of a federal prisoner is roughly the same as a Harvard education, actually. So it's low cost. You don't have to prove anything. The Syrian Kurds the Syrian Kurds are not trying anybody. So they're in prison indefinitely. And my guess is that from the point of view of many governments, they expect these people will stay in these prisons for the rest of their lives, and conditions being what they are, those lives may not be all that long. I mean, we've been talking about women and children. We haven't said hardly a word about the men, of which there's several thousand foreign men fighters. And nobody's really talking about repatriating them. And they're being held in, I've seen the prisons, 20, 30 people to a cell. They're fed, but I mean, it's basically a life sentence. I talked to the father of one foreign fighter who was in the SDF prisons and now is in federal prison. And he told me that his son says, "Oh my God, I'm so happy to be here. It's like being in a 5-star hotel, a maximum security prison." So it's different. And just to look how this goes, I think you know, Anne, about the Houris centers. This is an effort by the SDF to take teenage boys out of the camps and basically re-educate them, de-radicalize them. But what happens when they turn 18, when they graduate from these Houris centers? They actually go to prison because there's no place else to put them. So even if you had trials there and you had 2-year sentences or any sentence of any, you were acquitted, you would still be in prison because France isn't going to repatriate French citizens, even if they've been acquitted in the Kurdish courts or even if they've served their sentences. I mean, their position is you left France and we're just not going to take you back. And that's the position of quite a number of countries.
We have a question from a colleague that has worked on repatriation. He didn't put it in public, but he's asking, what about the ideological indoctrination and what's being done before these people would be put back into society? And that is one of the things that the Houris centers are doing. Maybe you can speak just a little bit about that. And there are efforts now with NGOs going into the camps, trying to work with the younger kids and work with the mothers. Could you speak about what you know about prevention and de-radicalization efforts?
Sure, there are these Houris centers, and I think they have some European funding, and it is focused on teenage boys. I don't know how you measure the success of de-radicalization, but what's clear is that you then need to have something to deal where the graduates go, which is not back to prison where they would be radicalized again. There's a significant number of women, a minority, but a significant number who have completely rejected the Islamic State. They dress in a Western fashion. Shamimam's one, Hoda's another. They don't fast during Ramadan. They would like to go back to their countries. That they're at risk. So there is a self-de-radicalization that has taken place. I think that should be the nucleus of some effort. And I'm hoping that at least for some of these cases, there might be some local resettlement options or local employment options. As you imagine, if in any prison system, instead of you go from maximum security to minimum security to a halfway house. So maybe there could be some kind of halfway house arrangements. But this would be an option for, the local option would be for a very small number of people. Some of these women, though, I mean, they could work in the SOS villages. Some are fluent, obviously, in English and Arabic. So they have some skills that might be useful in the area.
Well, you've made me really think, because when I worked on prison de-radicalization programs, and the biggest one was in Iraq in 2006, 2007, that was applied to 23,000 detainees and 800 juveniles. The idea was selling to the detainee the idea, if you participate in this, it's good for you. So, I mean, with the Houris centers, it's just the opposite. You participate, and as you age up, you have nothing to hope for, unless your country decides to take you home. I mean, how depressing. Because usually what you're trying to do is, incentivize people to see that the decisions they made and the group they believed in were not good for them. Because as our colleague Faraya told us, which Zimbardo said, he said no one's born I don't remember what you said, but I've repeated it, no one's born a terrorist. And that's what I've certainly found. And Molly, maybe you can tell us the statistics. I never remember our statistics from our research. Molly's our stats person. But we looked at the issue of spontaneous de-radicalization in our sample. And in our sample, I think it was 271 at the time Molly did the stats on it. We looked at how radicalized people were if they were travelers when they traveled into ISIS. Their peak of radicalization was almost always when they went through Sharia training, which the men were forced to do. And some women went through, but very few. The men were supposed to teach their wives at home. And Sharia training was carried out by people that appeared to be good scholars, that they really knew Islam. Of course, they didn't know Islam, in its proper interpretation. They knew a sick, distorted, extreme minority view of Islam, but they taught it in a way that was really convincing, and they were charismatic and knowledgeable. So the peak of radicalization was then, but slowly, over time, people saw so many things that contradicted it that they spontaneously de-radicalized. And we also saw, especially with the men, when they're housed in these rooms with 20, 30 people in a room together, that they were sharing stories. And the stories are so overwhelming of how the Iraqi leaders had the gold and the trucks and the food and Baghouz and all escaped, while the Europeans or foreigners were starving, their kids died. And they end up in prison, and they're like, wait a second, I think we were really used and lied to and duped. So a spontaneous radicalization has been going on. Molly, I don't know if you're alert. She hasn't been feeling good the last day.
No, I am alert. And I'm looking in our paper. It was closer to 240 when we did this original analysis. Trying to find the exact numbers. It was a big difference, close to 50% for women, but
spontaneously de-radicalized.
Yeah, and what we found, which I thought was more interesting, perhaps than the raw numbers, was that it was people were significantly more likely to have been spontaneously de-radicalized if they had these much higher ideals going into ISIS, if they, explicitly said that they were going to be, seeking an identity rather than seeking a job or looking to, get out of a life situation, because those things, they were able to at least somewhat meet what they said their needs were. Rather than the people who really thought that they were going to find, a personal, purpose in life. And those people were more likely to be spontaneously de-radicalized.
So thank you, Molly, for that. So we have seen, without even a program being put in place, that people do de-radicalize. And there's so much cynicism on the whole idea of de-radicalization, but it does occur. And, good cognitive psychology would tell you that. You can talk people into ideas and you can talk them back out. I mean, these people—
I use it a lot.
I'm sorry?
I use it a lot. I use cognitive psychology a lot.
Thank you. So one last, well, actually, Peter, I should just let you give a summary statement. Although you are being asked, will you continue your repatriation efforts of the US Canadian children and women, or help them out of the camp? And please just give a closing statement, because we do try to end pretty much on time. And we so thank you for sharing with us and for your expertise and knowledge as a diplomat and a politician and good-hearted, good man.
Well, you're very kind.
No, truthful.
Very, very truthful. Thank you, though. Well, I will continue to do what I can. I have to say I'm not I'm not focused just on U.S. Canadian, but where I can be helpful, I will. It's much easier to repatriate children, and the SDF and the AANES is more open when the mother. I mean, they are not agreeable at this stage to repatriating children where the mother doesn't agree, but where the mother does agree, they've been open. And so I've been able to do a few of those cases. I think, for the women, these have been people who, they're convinced have not committed any crimes, that they have no evidence they engaged in terrorist activity, and they've investigated them. I think without the main route is always going to have to be governments requesting their people. And I think the SDF and ANS is trying to decide, do they want to prosecute locally say some of the more extreme cases, or do they want to send them back to countries to handle? My bottom line is my message is very simple, which is that we cannot let the best be the enemy of the good. And by simply insisting on what we believe is the ideal solution, which is that everybody be repatriated, and not contemplating a lesser solution, a less good solution, that nonetheless will be better for the children than the alternative, which is to remain in the camps indefinitely, is really, it's a bad policy. And I think it's morally incorrect. To go to your analogy, it's a bit like saying, if not everybody can get in the lifeboats, nobody should get in the lifeboats. Well, let's save the people that we can, and the people we can are children and those that from the countries that are going to be willing to repatriate. And we have to recognize that not every country is going to do that.
Thank you, Ambassador Galbraith. And thank you to everyone that attended. And I always love watching the chat. Sometimes it's distracting, but it's wonderful to see all these good thoughts and good thinkers. We will go through it, and we'll send it around later today with a recording of this event that you can share with others. So thank you to everyone for your time, especially you, Ambassador Galbraith.
Thank you, Anne.
Okay,
and for all
bye-bye.
your work.
Bye-bye.